So what do deer eat? Well, they eat browse, not because it's the best, the highest nutritional plant in the pasture, as much as it's the highest volume. They have to get full every day, so they have to find things that they can get full with. If we look at different categories of browse, it's not all created equal. We have some very good browse, such as a hackberry. Leaves are moderately large. They don't mature and get coarser that much as they go through the summer, and so it's an excellent browse plant for deer. The little leaf sumac is our representative of one I call fair. Not that it's so much lower in nutrients, but that it has much smaller leaves, and it takes a lot more time and energy for a deer to fill up on plants that have very small leaves versus plants that have large leaves. And then we come to one that we call poor. Again, not nutritionally poor, but it has some secondary compounds in it that restrict intake. Both juniper and the oaks, which are prevalent in a lot of West Texas, have leaves that have secondary compounds in them that have to be broken down and detoxified by the liver. Otherwise, they can cause digestive problems or even be toxic to the animals. And so they can only eat a certain amount. Now, the one good thing about a lot of these plants that have these secondary compounds is that they're evergreen, meaning they don't lose their leaves. So in the winter, that is an available forage, but still those secondary compounds keep them from eating as much as they want. They eat what they can, though. Forbs are our next category. These are our highest quality plants in the pasture. We have two categories, annual and perennial. All of our browse plants are perennials, and they have a woody stem, a woody bark. Forbs do not have that woody bark. They can get a coarse bark, but it's still not woody. The annual forbs germinate from a seed, grow herbaceous material, flower, produce a seed, and die in one growing season. The critical thing about annuals is that we have to have rainfall to have annuals. If it doesn't rain in the period of the year that they are germinating, then we do not have annuals for the rest of that season. Perennials, on the other hand, germinate from seed, grow herbaceous material, may or may not flower and produce a seed, but they only die back down either to a stem, to a main stem, or to a bud zone near the ground level or below ground level. These are very important in management of deer because they do come back year after year. Whether it rains or not at time of germination, they will have live roots in the ground so that anytime it rains that we have growing conditions, they can grow. So they are a real good tool to work for when you're managing plants for deer in their habitat, is to try to establish as many perennial plants as we can. The annual forbs are the very highest nutritional quality plants in the pasture, followed closely by the perennial plants. Grasses is our last category, and deer can and do eat a certain amount of grass, mainly when there's not as many forbs available or browse, such in the winter when a lot of our browse loses its leaves. But they eat short grass, 1 to 3 inches tall. That portion on the left of that left picture, it'd be the area where deer would spend more time, more so than out in the taller wheat. The wheat there is beginning to get to the level of the digestibility is lower in it, and the deer don't do as well on it. They'll eat it if they have to, but they don't do well. On the right is one of our introduced grasses. It's a introduced blue stem, and we do find that deer tend to like certain grasses. They tend to like side oats. They tend to like these blue stems more than they like some of the other native grasses that we have in the pasture. But again, they all eat them at a very short level, not in a big tall level. What sources of nutrients do we have for our deer? Hopefully, the number one is native plants. And with native plants, we need a lot of diversity, and you'll hear more about this at camp. We need many different species of plants out there because they will be growing, blooming, producing mast or seed or fruits at different times of the year, and that gives a long-term potential diet for the deer, as opposed to having just one or two types of plants there. This is a set of data, native forage data from a ranch in Tom Green County. Now, the story behind this is this was a sheep and cattle ranch for many, many years, and they were active in their brush control and kept a good bit of brush off the ranch. And then they decided to get in the deer business. They high fenced it. It's 4,500 acres, and control the deer population in it. And I worked with them for 10 years trying to determine what deer really need in the pasture, what nutritional values do we have. These are protein values across this chart here, and each color is a different year, and by different months you can see how the years progressed. But you see we've got a very large variation in protein level, ups and downs. This ranch, the deer on this ranch depend a whole lot on annual FORBS and a good bit on perennial FORBS. There's some browse, but not a whole lot of browse. That's the problem with the variation here, in that in a dry year, we have very low levels of protein. In a wet year, we have very high levels of protein. And so it's an unstable kind of a habitat. If we take and we average that over that 10-year period, this is the graph that we begin to see. Kind of a bump up in protein in the spring, then we droop down into the summer, and a little bit of bump in the fall due to fall. If we get fall rains and our winter annuals kick in, we get a boost there. But you can see from those bars that we don't get a boost every year. This is still our yellow line, which is our average of that Tom Green County, but we're superimposed now 3 or 4 years of data from a experiment station, Texas AgriLife experiment station south of Sonora, Texas. This was an experiment they were doing in some high fence area, 300 acres, but the population was in line with the habitat that they had. And you'll notice that the protein level on average is much lower than the FORBS, the diet that's influenced much more by FORBS. This habitat at Sutton County was primarily live oak, red oak, and junipers, both ash juniper and redberry juniper. The protein of those plants is not as high. It's more consistent if you look at the variation in those lines versus the variation in the bars of the other graph, but it's not quite as high. This is the same data from Tom Green County, but we graphed across here the energy value, estimated energy value. We estimate energy by taking the fiber content of the different fibers and using equations to make an estimation of energy value, and it seems to work very well. If we look at the energy level of the browse, it's not near as much lower as the protein was. And that's because deer are very, very selective in what they eat, and they seem to be able to discern this fiber content. And so they eat only those plants that will break down quickly in their rumen. And that means that even though they're getting a lower protein diet from the oak and juniper, their energy level is very similar. And this is the thing that really hammers home the problem with annual FORBS. This is a variation in what our estimated forage intake or forage availability per acre was. And look at the high extremes we have. In wet years, like in 2005, we had worlds of forage. In a very dry year, like Brown 2003, we had very low forage through the whole year. And that's the problem that we have. The browse plants give us more stability. The forb plants give us much more quality. And so, and trying to reach an equilibrium of the two or a mixture of the two that give us our optimum diet is what we strive for in deer management. This is the Sonora data versus the Tom Green County data, and notice with our browse plants, we've got a much more steady diet. So the browse plays a very important input into what deer eat and how much they're able to eat every day.